Hi, this is a video that will just kind of go through each of the chapters and just highlight some of the general topics that are in each chapter from our book that will show up on the AP exam. So chapter 1 was on exploring data, and things that we did were we learned again to distinguish between categorical variables versus quantitative. You should be able to do that. We talked about comparing distributions. You need to use comparative words anytime that they talk about comparing distributions. And again, when they talk about, they ask you to describe a distribution, you want to talk about your SACs, your shape, your center, your spread, and your outliers. Again, and looking for unusual features. If you remember from our first semester exam, in our first semester exam, we had a question that said describe interesting features, and there was a gap. Gap is really important. We talked about shape, which is bimodal sometimes, or symmetric, or one-peaked. And if they're comparing them, then you want to talk about how is the peak greater than, less than, the same, how is the shape different or the same, how are the centers and spreads different and the same. Again, in terms of outliers, you need to be able to know that outlier rule. So go back to chapter 1 and kind of look over that outlier rule. And then that fourth bullet point on here, use statistical terms carefully. Don't say mean if you actually want the word median. Range is just what is that single number from high to low. So are the quartile 1 and quartile 3 and interquartile range. And then they just kind of have statements down here that say skewed is a shape. So you always talk about the shape being skewed. Outliers would pull the mean or not skew the mean. Outliers would pull the mean in one direction. Things that you should probably know how to do on your calculator would be looking back on page 36. Do you know how to make a histogram and change the width of the histogram? How do you make box plots? And then how do you do your numerical summaries, that one var stats options? So those are some things that you should know from chapter 1. And I really recommend that you go back through and read some of the chapter reviews, look at the chapter summaries, as you start to review for the AP exam. Chapter 2, we talked mostly about normal distributions in chapter 2, being able to calculate a z-score. And one of the things that I just wanted to highlight in this piece is we briefly mentioned what a normal probability plot is. They don't state it on the AP outline directly, but they're starting to infuse it a little bit more. Normal probability plots, again, are ways to decide if your data is normal, and on your calculator, you want to see if that normal probability plot has a linear pattern. So in chapter 2, that's just something that you want to go back and look at. You should know how to calculate z-scores, looking them up the probabilities in your calculator or in the table. And again, things that you should know on your calculator that might be helpful are those exact things. Page 116 and page 125 particularly tell you those calculator features. After chapter 2, we went into chapter 3, and chapter 3 was on a lot of scatter plots. If you're asked to make a scatter plot, make sure that you always label the axes. Don't just copy what's in your calculator. If they want you to make it very clear, crisp, and with all the labels. If you're asked to interpret correlation, make sure that you recognize correlation is the letter R. Start by looking at the scatter plot. Make sure that you address the direction of a scatter plot. Is it positive? Is it negative? Address the form of a scatter plot. Is it linear? Is it curved? Is it scattered? Address the strength. Correlation is the measurement of strength. So again, closer to 1 means that it's a positive, strong association between the data. Closer to -1 would be a negative, strong association between the data points. And if you're close to 0, that means that it's weak. You also want to be able to identify sort of influential points or outlier points. How do they affect your correlation? How do they affect your slope? how do they affect your y-intercept? Again, when displaying the equation of a least squares regression line, the calculator will report a slope and intercept that's much more precise than we need. And so what we mean by that is there's no rule on how many decimal places. So our advice is, again, decide how many place values you want based on the context of the problem. That's sort of the first, they call that the first section of the AP exam. The next section let me finish chapter 3. Chapter 3, we also talked about what happens if you square R. You would have your correlation of determination, that's R squared. And again, that's where we had this interesting statement that you'd have a certain percentage of the variation in your Y value is accounted for by a linear model relating your Y value to your X value, that explanatory variable. The formula sheet does give you ways to find your slope and to find your y-intercept if you're given really some numerical summaries, the mean of your x's, the standard deviation of your x's, the mean of your y's, and the standard deviation of your y's, as well as your correlation. You should be able to find those algebraically. And again, these are the calculator tips for chapter 3. Know how to make scatter plots, know how to find linear regression lines, and then something else that we talked about in chapter 3 are what are residual plots. Residual plots, again, are what's your typical, how far off is your prediction from what actually happened, and that's a plot of all of those sort of differences. Are you predicting too much? Are you predicting too little? So then there's chapter 4. Chapter 4 has a lot of vocabulary because we were talking about studies and we talked about bias. So again, when you're talking about, when they ask you about bias, make sure that you're always discussing what is the type of bias and then what's the direction. Are we overestimating? Are we underestimating based on that type of bias? Again, types of bias are the ways that we sample. So a convenience sample is a type of bias. And then they kind of give you an example here. Confounding variables are ways that you can have data that's a little biased or not accurate. Other things that you have to be able to do from chapter 4 is be able to tell the difference between an observational study and an experiment. Experiments, there is some sort of direct treatment imposed. And you should be able to describe how the treatments are assigned, what they are specifically, what are you measuring, what are you comparing. Remember we talked about drawing diagrams in 4, that's really nice, but you do need to write sentences if it says the word describe. And then the really big thing is that there's a lot of vocabulary in chapter 4 is just make sure that you know the differences between what are experimental designs and what are observational study words. What's the difference between a experimental design and a sampling method? So just be very careful about that. Again, a block design is an experimental method, not a sampling method. Non-response is a sampling problem, not an experimental problem. Really, the only thing that we did with our calculator in chapter 4 was just talking about choosing a simple random sample. The most basic one that you can always do is just throw everybody's name in a hat and pull them out. But we sometimes said that that was not always the most efficient. So knowing how to, again, assign every individual a number and then randomly choose those numbers using the random digit table or, as this says, using your calculator. Chapter 5, we had probability. They're going to ask you to do some simulation related to probability, and again, using that random digit table. This is linked as well, so all these page numbers you can come back to. Many probability problems do involve simple computations that you can do on your calculator, but just make sure that you show your work. We talked about don't leave a naked answer at any time. And then I highly recommend chapters 5 and even 6, really looking through that chapter review. Chapter review for chapter 5 is on page 338. there's just a lot of rules and questions, and most people feel the least prepared for the probability section. And that's kind of where we're going to head next as we assign some progress checks as well. Nothing really in your calculator that was really specific. Chapter 6 was on random variables. That was kind of going through and discussing some binomial settings, some geometric settings, talking about how you can combine random variables, combined their means, and combined standard deviations, and how those processes work. And then using those random variables to, again, still calculate potentially normal distribution problems. There are a lot of calculator tips for chapter 6. Again, they have the pages listed here, and as I mentioned, talking about binomial settings versus geometric settings was chapter 6. Chapter 7 was on sampling distributions, and we had a whole slew of different variables that we added with hats and lines and subscripts and such. So there were a lot of different terminology as well. There's a difference between the population distribution versus a sample distribution, and those were all the dot plots that we'd always make on the backboard. We'd ask if they were a sampling distribution, and technically a sampling distribution is all of the samples of that size that you possibly could take. So again, just kind of make sure you know your notation, because if you're not using it correctly, they will reduce your points. Then chapters 8, 9, and 10 are just going through confidence intervals, and I'm going to let you look through this slideshow as well on your own. But again, notice what the last piece says. You may use your calculator to do confidence intervals, but there's a risk. If you give the calculator answer with no work, you'll either get full credit for the do step or no credit if you're totally wrong. So make sure that you always also add that name of procedure and give the interval, because they're always looking for some sort of work to make sure that you really understand. Again, still required to do all of your steps, even if they don't explicitly state it. Really sketching your normal curve for these is really helpful. That's really going to be helpful in terms of assessing maybe normality, drawing that when you have a t-chart or a t-distribution. So kind of looking through those again. Remember, the back of your book goes through all the 4 steps, conditions, and equations. Here are how we did on our calculator. Most of you are fairly calculator savvy. You don't have to use your calculator. You can do it all by hand, but those are the page numbers for confidence intervals. Chapter 9 was doing the hypothesis test for the first time. Again, conclusions, talk about do you reject or do you fail reject, talk about it in context, explicitly state if the p-value is greater than or less than that alpha level. Be very careful that you're using the correct language. Let's see, if you use your calculator again, make sure that you're saying the name, reporting statistic, degrees of freedom, p-value. You can't just write down what's on your calculator screen. You do need to have all of those other pieces as well. And if you're doing a t-distribution, you have to make a little sketch of the graph, not just say there's no outliers. And again, here are those same calculator tips for chapter 9. And then the last chapter that will be assessed on this year's exam is going to be chapter 10, and that's where we did all the same things that we did with confidence intervals and tests, but we did them for 2. So again, these are listing the same things. You can go back and look at the slideshow on your own, but just make sure that you're showing enough work. It's really saying exactly the same things, but just making sure that you have your 2 sample notation. And then you're looking at those calculator shortcuts as well. So I just kind of wanted to go through and just kind of highlight each of the 10 chapters again. I know that was really quick. You can go through this slideshow on your own. Somebody else asked about just going through sort of a vocabulary review from each unit, and so that will kind of be coming next. So thank you.